So, just the other day I was taking a look at my list of the 10 strongest Bankai in Bleach from over a year ago, thinking about potentially revisiting and re-evaluating it in the near future, when it occurred to me that I've never done a video looking at the opposite end of the spectrum, looking at the Bankai often considered the weakest or worst in the series. Probably a contentious topic to be sure, but also a fun one to try and tackle. Now, the biggest issue with a list like this, in my opinion, is that there are no truly weak Bankai. As far as I'm concerned, it wouldn't make sense if there were. After all, a Bankai is supposed to be a Shinigami's ultimate trump card, their most powerful ability only to be used in the most dire of circumstances. So while I don't think there's too much merit in looking at them simply as the weakest, it's also true that not all Bankai are created equal. There are some Bankai that are simply less versatile, less effective, and have bigger and more numerous drawbacks and disadvantages than those that you might find on the strongest Bankai list. So that's how we're going to try and approach this video, but as always, a list like this is just my subjective opinion, so please let me know your lists in the comments. I always find it enlightening to see how off base I am, or if our thoughts might actually align. Before we get started on the video, guys, if you haven't hit subscribe yet, make sure to do that now for more Bleach content like this every single week, and if you enjoyed the video, make sure to give it a thumbs up as well to help support me and the channel. And if you want to take that support from me another step further, I do also have a Patreon as well, and as always, I want to say a massive shout out and a huge thank you to each and every one of you supporting me over there on Patreon. I really do appreciate it. And as always, there will be spoilers for the entirety of the 1000-Year Blood War arc in this video, as well as some of the light novel Can't Fear Your Own World. Now, I've got 9 Bankai to go through here on this list, but before we get to any of those, first, I've got an honourable mention. Now, this Bankai is on here as an honourable mention because I couldn't work out whether it might go on the best or strongest Bankai list, or the worst one, thanks to the crippling disadvantaged state it leaves its wielder in. And that Bankai is Shuhei Hisagi's Fushi no Kojo, as revealed in Can't Fear Your Own World. Now, I really like the overall look and feel of this Bankai. The sinister, ominous energy and the captive imagery of the chains really works for Hisagi as a character. Basically, Fushi no Kojo links both fighters by chains wrapped around their necks to a massive orb suspended above them. This lingering black mass acts as a reservoir of their combined Reiatsu. As long as the Bankai is active, neither fighter can be killed, and their Reiatsu is constantly being drained to heal their wounds, even those that should be fatal. And that's why I feel like this Bankai could be considered one of the best. It allows Hisagi to fight on even ground with an opponent that might have considerably more Reiatsu than him, because their respective Reiatsu is distributed evenly amongst them during battle. But on the flip side, Hisagi could never win a fight with his Bankai alone. He must deactivate it before it completely drains the Reiatsu of both fighters, or else he, along with his opponent, will be killed. Not only that, but Hisagi's Bankai only puts him on an even playing field in terms of Reiatsu. If his opponent is simply more powerful or a more adept fighter, they'll still be doing more damage overall. When it comes down to that final moment, once the Bankai's effects are lifted, Hisagi absolutely needs someone else around to step in and administer the final blow. So this is a tough one for me. It's a cool Bankai, but it can only go so far, and I feel like that hampers its usefulness in a big way. Not enough that it actually gets a spot on this list, but I felt I should mention it anyway. Now then, kicking off the actual list itself with number 9, we have a pretty cool Bankai for a pretty cool character, and that's Rose's Kinshara Butodan, a favourite of mine, and someone whose Bankai I was pleasantly surprised to see in the 1000-Year Blood War arc. Using the power of sound and music, Rose can trick his opponents into imagining they're being injured and then for that imagined injury to become reality. For example, Rose's dance troupe ignite Mask de Masculine with a powerful flame, except they're not actually doing that. But because the melody being played makes Mask believe it's happening, he actually gets burned. It's the same as when he's crushed violently by a torrent of water, just one of what seems to be many different dances at Rose's disposal. Kinshara Butodan's dance troupe of death is an incredibly stylish and unique Bankai, perfect for the character, but it comes with a massive fatal flaw. If the enemy can't hear the music for whatever reason, its powers become totally useless. It's not so much a weakness as it is a literal kill switch that renders the Bankai completely ineffective. We see Mask de Masculine destroy his own eardrums, removing all of the Bankai's power, and in a universe like Bleach where limbs and body parts can be restored and healed with ease, that doesn't feel like a pretty big sacrifice. In fact, Mask's own eardrums are returned to him in the very next chapter. There's also the slight issue that Rose's Bankai removes his weapon entirely, unfurling his whip in order to create the dancers. Maybe I'm being a little harsh on Rose. It really is a clever, creative, and pretty strong Bankai, and perhaps if he'd shut his mouth about its abilities, Mask wouldn't have figured out what was going on. But the fact that that option is there to totally and utterly render the Bankai null and void, I feel it's worth a place on this list. Now, this next Bankai is not one I would expect to see on here in the future, once the Shinigami in question has had a bit of time to get to know it better, to grow it and mature it, and overall make it more stable, less unwieldy, and crucially, less dangerous. But that Bankai is Rukia Kuchiki's Haka no Togame. Haka no Togame is a beautiful spectacle befitting of Rukia and Sode no Shirayuki's grace. It's also incredibly risky to use. Yes, Rukia was able to kill As not in a single stroke of her translucent icy blade. But what if she comes up against anyone stronger than him, more durable than him? If Rukia's enemy survives her Bankai in its current state that we've seen in the canon story itself, then they're faced with a Rukia who is completely and utterly helpless. The one time we saw Rukia use her Bankai in the source material, she almost shattered her own body by attempting to move and release it too fast. As Byakuya himself says, this is a dangerous Bankai to wield. It seems to be, from the very small snippet we got, a powerful one. But right now, Rukia is just too inexperienced with it, or at least she was before that final time skip. It leaves her too vulnerable and too exposed, seemingly rooted to the ground as she attempts to thaw herself out slowly, lest she kill herself on the spot. The mobile game Bleach Brave Souls gave us a tantalizing look at a Rukia who has had more time to evolve her powers, and Haka no Togame really comes into its own there as she skates around effortlessly. But for now, in terms of what we've seen in the pages of Bleach itself, I'm happy having it on the list. Mayuri Kurotsuchi is always such a tricky character to rank, no matter the subject or criteria. When it comes to his Bankai Konjiki Ashisogi Jizo, he's able to modify it, reform it, smash it and break it, and do just about anything he likes to it. But in terms of the Bankai we see in the story before the 1,000-Year Blood War arc, I think it deserves a spot on the list. Perhaps the most glaring issue with this Bankai is the fact it's a gigantic, organic target. Mayuri's Bankai summons an abomination behind him, and in nearly every fight we see it in, it's either destroyed or controlled in some way. Interestingly, Mayuri activating his Bankai is never what actually wins him a fight. The Bankai just seemingly creates a nice spectacle, but is generally defeated in some way. It's Mayuri's own tricks that end up winning the day, which I think is fitting. The Bankai is also surprisingly limited in its versatility. It sprouts a bouquet of blades from its chest, making it appear to be mostly melee-focused in combat. Its most potent ability is the noxious gas cloud it spreads from its mouth, but aside from that, Konjiki Ashisogi Jizo doesn't really have much going for it. Now, the modified version we get in the 1,000-Year Blood War is a totally different story, and would probably find its way onto the strongest Bankai list instead, so at least Mayuri was able to upgrade. As the Bankai of our main character, it's only natural that Tensa Zangetsu would grow and improve over the course of the story. Therefore, the original version of Tensa is the only one that's making it onto this list. As far as I'm concerned, once Ichigo gets his powers back in the Lost Agent arc, that's a whole different ballgame. This version of Ichigo's Bankai has always felt a bit muted to me, which I think makes sense considering how little of his own true power he's actually using. But he's unable to defeat Byakuya with it alone without Zangetsu interfering, and after that he remains in Bankai for such an unusually long time that it really loses all impact. Once we get to the Urankar arc and the emphasis is instead placed on his hollow mask, his Bankai well and truly takes a back seat. The impressive speed boost he gets is nice, specifically earlier on, but even that begins to slowly fade into the background over time. And of course, once Ichigo gets the hang of using the Black Getsuga, the Bankai's overall strength increases with it. And really that's the key with Ichigo. He's all about growth, and we get to see his Bankai grow alongside him. So while the first version of Tensa Zangetsu is absolutely iconic, I think it deserves its spot. Soifon's Bankai Jakuho Raikoben has been roundly criticised a lot in the past within the Bleach community, and mostly fairly too, I would say. Again, this is a really cool and unique Bankai, but it comes with an awful lot of drawbacks and is honestly pretty worthless in most circumstances, adding very little value to Soifon's already impressive skill set. Even when she manages to pull the Bankai off, we've yet to see it be used truly successfully. Equipping Soifon with a massive missile launcher, Jakuho Raikoben is cumbersome, slow, and extremely draining to use. Jakuho Raikoben uses so much Reiatsu that Soifon herself claimed she could only fire it once every 3 days, and was visibly exhausted after being forced to use it twice in quick succession. While Soifon herself chastises her Bankai as being ill-suited for an assassin due to being overly flashy, this is only one of a few issues that it has. That being said, I do think it fits her overall. It represents the more volatile, explosive side of her personality that she doesn't like. But the Bankai just seems to be fatally poorly designed for combat in general. In one instance of her using it, we see Soifon needs to prepare in order to do so, requiring her to find the time and space necessary to set up her steel sash first. And while the theme of her Bankai is clear, where her Shikai requires 2 steps to kill, the Bankai should theoretically only need 1. Both times she's landed a successful hit, her enemies have survived. Jakuho Raikoben seems to be pretty good at blowing off faces, but not actually finishing anyone off, although I do wonder what Baragon would have actually looked like had he returned to his base form after losing half of his skull, were that even possible at that point. Here we have another unfortunate Bankai for a character I'm a big fan of. When you're talking about the overall weakest or worst Bankai in Bleach, Seijin Komamura's Kokujo Tengen Myo is always going to make an appearance, but as with some of his contemporaries before him, we'll only be taking into consideration Kokujo Tengen Myo as it appears before the 1,000-Year Blood War, where it undergoes a rather interesting change that in my opinion would see it lifted out of this list. Don't get me wrong, Komamura's Bankai is an amazing sight to behold, and the giant warrior wields near unparalleled physical strength, able to kill an equally colossal Urankar in a single sword strike and rupture and mangle Tozen's arm with ease after they clash. Kokujo Tengen Myo was also indirectly improved with the revelation that broken Bankai can never be fixed. Komamura's close bond with his Bankai makes his the sole exception, meaning that when it takes a hit, it will at least recover, given enough time. And it better be prepared to take a hit, because Komamura's Bankai simply creates one enormous target with a pretty big sword, and that's about it. Komamura himself is more of a brawler-style character, so it makes sense, but the Bankai's biggest drawback is just that. It can't really do anything outside of copy Komamura's own movements. To make matters even worse, any damage dealt to the giant is also reflected upon Komamura himself, meaning that not only do you now have a huge target, but also a more fragile and riskier one than you might have originally anticipated. Kensei's Bankai Tekken Tachikaze just feels unimpressive to me. There's not even really that much to say about it. Taking Tachikaze's core ability, the power to detonate explosive bursts along the knife's slashes, and instead apply it to Kensei's fists sounds pretty cool on paper, and Kensei is well known for his proficiency in hand-to-hand combat, making this Bankai perfectly suited. But it seems to be really limited in both scope and versatility. Not only does his Bankai completely negate his range, reducing the overall effectiveness of his original core ability, but we see his Bankai in action against Masked Masculine, and it has little to no effect at all, even when seemingly being used at full throttle. Kensei slams his fist into Mask's gut, and we see the full force of his explosive punches being rammed into the Stern Ritter one after the other, while the idea of it endlessly punching is pretty cool, and might be more effective perhaps on a less durable opponent. Mask returns almost completely unharmed, and all Kensei's Bankai can seemingly do in response is change the protrusions on his hand, which, and I'm only really speculating here, maybe just increases the concentration of his punches even further. All in all, it's just a bit of a disappointing Bankai in general. There's very little spectacle, there's not much going on visually of interest, and it just seems to be pretty weak and even somewhat stunted. Coming in at number 2, Renji's initial Bankai, Hihio Zabimaru, is enormous, imposing, ferocious, and severely lacking in many ways. This feels like a similar situation to Ichigo's Tensa Zangetsu and to a lesser extent Rukia's Haka no Togame. These are all Bankai that have really only just been learned, and therefore it's expected that they'll come with drawbacks. To compound that even further, Hihio Zabimaru turns out to not even be the true name of Renji's Bankai at all. What this leaves him with, for the majority of the story, is a Bankai that looks amazing but offers very little. The enormous size of the skeletal snake makes controlling it elegantly difficult, and while elegance might not be Renji's thing, the duel against Byakuya exposes how the messiness of this weapon's design can easily be used against it. Then there's its fragility. This is another Bankai that makes for a very big target, and while it can be used both offensively and defensively, using the individual segments to both block attacks and withstand damage risks them being forever broken. There is versatility here. Hikot's Taiho gives the Bankai additional range, and Renji can freely control the individual segments using his Reiatsu. But at the end of the day, this is another massive, fragile, and slow Bankai that's both difficult to wield effectively and doesn't pack enough killing power to be truly useful in the heat of battle. The true version of his Bankai, Soo Zabimaru, seems to be vastly superior in almost every way, except perhaps visual design. But taking the dubious honour of the top spot on my list of the quote-unquote worst Bankai in Bleach, well, Ikkaku might have the single most badass Bankai call-out in the history of the series, but unfortunately that doesn't make up for everything Ryumon Hozakimaru lacks. Admittedly, we only get a fleeting glimpse of this Bankai in the series, so it's possible we're missing key elements. Maybe Ikkaku was still in the process of mastering and completing his Bankai. Unlike others on this list, however, not only is that not confirmed, but nothing comes of it either. Instead, Ikkaku wields a clumsy, brute force Bankai that is smashed to pieces in its first on-screen battle. Ryumon Hozakimaru has very little going for it outside of a sleek and menacing visual design. In the state we saw it in, the Bankai is certainly capable of outputting some damage, but it feels like a glass cannon, and the cannonball it packs isn't even particularly dangerous. One hit from the Fraction Edrad is enough to crack one of the Bankai's brittle blades, and by the end of the fight, there's nothing left to salvage. In order to defeat this opponent, Ikkaku is forced to give it his all, and even potentially renders his Bankai unusable in the future as a result. Then there's the Bankai's own nature to contend with as well. As his Zanpakuto is lazy and often slumbering when a fight begins, Ikkaku needs to put in the work himself before his Bankai even reaches its true potential. The gimmick of being able to power up his Bankai as a fight goes on is interesting, but again, risky. The only reason Ikkaku gets away with spinning his Bankai to speed up that process is because Edoras sits back and lets him do it, and even at its most powerful state, it's still reduced to a smoking stick in the end. Maybe there is still some place Ikkaku can take his Bankai, we don't know. But with limited range and a fighting style that favours getting up close and personal with your opponent, Ryumon Hozakimaru is too delicate, too sluggish, and generally too weak for the job it needs to do. And that's it for my video on what I believe to be the worst or weakest Bankai in Bleach. Again, it's a very difficult video to make, because like I said at the start, I don't feel there are any truly weak Bankai, but not all Bankai are created equal, and there are certainly those with more drawbacks, more disadvantages, and just in general more failings than those you might find on the strongest Bankai list. But I'd love to hear your lists in the comments below. Please do let me know. Let me know if you agree with any of my rankings, my candidates whatsoever. I'd love to hear your thoughts down below. Make sure to hit subscribe if you haven't done already. And until next time, guys, I'll catch you later. I'll see you then.